out to me. And looking at COVID-19, I think it's really important. Definitions of important diseases are surprisingly loose, perhaps embarrassingly so. So we're looking at an epidemic of COVID-19 that's putting people in hospital, and we're basing it on. I've spoken with Loretta Bolgan from Corvelva about COVID-19, and she said that the symptoms that they're seeing in Italy with COVID-19 are completely different. They're mainly gastric symptoms that then go on to neurological symptoms, which is not at all the flu-like symptoms that we're seeing in many other parts of the world. So how do we know what the symptoms of COVID-19 are in order to test
Well,
people?
right. So let me go back to SARS because there's an interesting difference and parallel between SARS 2003 and the coronavirus. So the definition of SARS was, and I mean this is why it's kind of embarrassing when you realize how simplistic it is you had to have a respiratory symptom, and as we discussed before the show, one of those was a fever of 38 degrees or more. When the standard body temperature it goes up to like 37.2 by some people's definitions. You had to have an epidemiological connection with another patient. So that's one of the reasons why so many medical staff got diagnosed, because of course they were working with SARS patients. And then thirdly, you needed a positive SARS test. And how SARS disappeared was that once they had everybody in hospitals or quarantined, it was not possible to have contact with a previous SARS patient. So they didn't test you for the virus, and therefore it went away. So the problem with coronavirus is that the test they were using in 2003 was based on PCR, which I think we'll probably talk about more later.
Yep.
Since then, their confidence in the technology has gotten out of control. This is a very powerful technology, but it's also technology can mislead you very easily. And so now a confirmed case by the World Health Organization definition is simply a positive coronavirus test. No symptoms, no contact with another patient. So what happened in Italy is like the first patient in Italy had not traveled, had no contact with another coronavirus patient. He just out of nowhere tested positive, and within 24 hours they had 30 other people, and none of them had a connection with their first patient. So then they start saying in Italy, well, anybody who's got symptoms, and there are no symptoms of coronavirus, it's like fever and a cough, which could mean anything,
Yep.
you should get tested. So this 88-year-old man in San Marino, which is further south, a long way from Lombardy, tests positive. Well, he hasn't traveled. He's probably quite sickly and elderly, and he hasn't been in contact with another patient. And there aren't any coronavirus cases anywhere around that, but they just skipped by the information that maybe this was a false positive test result, and then they diagnosed him. And then as the testing spread throughout Italy, so did the cases. And so it created the illusion that they had this massively infectious, quickly spreading infection, whereas what they actually had was a massive spread of testing with a test that produced an unknown number of false positives. I think the number of false positives is 100%. The Chinese published a paper saying it was only 80%. So we can argue over that. But it's treated by doctors as if the rate of false positives was 0%.
Right.
And that's an absurd position to be in. And if you accepted that there were some false positives, it would actually solve some mysteries, some impossible. I've been collecting impossible test results. And I think the most humorous is a 68-year-old man in a city 500 kilometers from Wuhan. He's got some minor symptoms like tiredness, cough, fever, stuff like that. So he goes to the hospital, they test him, he's positive. They keep him in the hospital, his symptoms resolve, and he tests negative. So now he has to go into quarantine for 14 days. So they put him in quarantine, and 3 days later they test him and he's positive again. But he has no symptoms. So they bring him back to the hospital and put him on antiviral drugs. They put him on drugs even though he had no symptoms.
Wow.
So they keep him in the hospital for a few days, and he tests negative. They're going to be sure this time. He tested negative 4 times. So they put him back into quarantine, and 3 days later, he tests positive again. So They drag him back to the hospital, put him on more antiviral drugs until he tests negative, and then they send him home. Now, nowhere in the paper from the Chinese medics did it say, possibly this could be a false positive. The South Koreans apparently have admitted that they have a large number of coronavirus patients who've tested positive. If they had symptoms, the symptoms resolved, they tested negative, and then a week later, 2 weeks later, they test positive again. And now they're saying, oh, these are false positives because they got pushed into a situation where they could not explain it any other way.
Right, they're cornered.
But, right.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to say that an asymptomatic person can be a false positive, there's no reason why a symptomatic person can't be a false positive. There's nothing that says if you have a cough, you can't have a false positive coronavirus test. So we have no idea how many false positive test results there are, and everybody sticks their head in the sand and says the test is amazing.
Maybe because there's a certain percentage or a certain segment of the government and the medical community that wants there to be a coronavirus pandemic, because if there wasn't, and we've locked down and we've destroyed the world's economy over nothing, they're going to have some explaining to do that they don't necessarily want to explain. Everyone seems to have bought into this bill of goods, and it might